On the phone, we have a member of the Hall of Fame, a gentleman I remember playing for the Raiders. He gave my Bears fits through the 80s. He became a successful broadcaster, actor. He does it all, Howie Long. Howie, I see that you went to Villanova for college, but you grew up in Massachusetts. What made you choose Villanova?
Really, it was I got to organize sports late. I was living with my grandmother in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and the desegregation busing riots started my freshman year and missed the majority of my freshman year because of that. At that point, we had, I grew up right under the L train in the city and played in the street every day, basketball, baseball, mostly, street hockey. I wanted to be Bobby Orr, but I had never played organized sports of any kind. My uncle, Billy, who had grown up in Charlestown and worked at Boston Housing Authority, the projects in the city, and did through his entire professional career, had lived the kind of quote-unquote American dream. He was the first person in the family to graduate from high school and moved out to a place called Milford, Massachusetts, and went out to Milford to live with him at my grandmother's request. He had 2 kids of his own and 2 adopted kids, and took me in at 13, and high school coach saw me walking down the hallway and asked who I was and if I was interested in coming out for the football team. And once I figured out how to put the equipment on, it kind of grew from there. But was really just a raw, big kid. I mean, by the time I got out of high school, I was 6'5", 225, and and had a scholarship to Boston College and to Villanova. And my grandmother was, I think, somewhat of she made a very sage decision that, it was probably best for me, given the turbulent circumstances of the area that I grew up in, to head down to Pennsylvania to go to Villanova. And they were both Catholic schools, and she was very heavily Catholic, Irish Catholic from Boston. So Villanova was a great option, and it turned out to be the perfect place for me. Very challenging academically, socially, financially, but once I got there, I never left. I was there Christmas break, Thanksgiving, spring break, summer school. Spent the next 4 years there, and they were 4 of the best years of my life.
I'm Catholic also. I thought all Catholics wanted their kids to go to Notre Dame, or is that just here in the Midwest?
Well, Notre Dame's the Villanova of the Midwest. In case you didn't know that.
I didn't know that. So what was it like playing
football? Well, I Notre Dame, of course. I mean, my cousin Michael has the Fighting Irishman tattooed on his hip. I mean, it's Notre Dame's kind of a fabled university for anyone who's Catholic or particularly Irish Catholic.
So what was it like playing at Villanova?
It was great. It was the perfect place for me. I probably had the opportunity to go to some other places that were probably smaller schools, never really considered or thought about it, but I went down there at 6'5", 225, and went to summer school down there. And by the time we got to training camp, I had a meal card and was working out for the first time and doing all those things. I was 6'5", 262, and went from what would have been probably an outside linebacker to nose guard in a 3-man front, and started every game my freshman year, took every it was just the right level for me. It was, we never played on television. We bused to most of our games. We stayed 3 to a room at the George Washington Motor Lodge, on the road or a night before a game. But they were the best of times. Made a lot of great friends there. Met my wife Diane there, and to this day we have 4 or 5 really, really good close friends, and a number of friends that have been kind enough to support causes that are directly associated with the university. They're supporting an older coach who needed some help, or the university program. So it's been great.
I see that you were the heavyweight boxing champion in college. Did you ever do the Rocky run through Philadelphia, up the museum steps to the statue?
To be honest, when you're at Villanova and you don't have a car, you're not spending a lot of time anywhere outside of that Bryn Mawr area. So no, I did not take the Rocky run up the steps, and I had become friends with someone from the boxing team, and the majority of the time I would get there, and whoever I was supposed to fight would kind of walk away. So it really wasn't much of a title.
Did you have any idea that you were going to get...
I enjoyed the boxing. I boxed in high school. Just kind of I think there were 4 or 5 of us in high school. Pat Cornelius and a couple of other people that would just box regularly in the basement of the high school. Over a little bit, and I still, through my professional career, I always have a heavy bag, and I always have a speed bag somewhere on whatever property I'm on.
Did the boxing help you with your hand-eye coordination, being a defensive lineman?
Not really. The only thing that it really helped me with was conditioning. If you think you're in shape and you think you understand what taking yourself just to the limit is, get in a boxing ring and go 3 minutes. And I was holding out. What year was it? 83, maybe. I trained with a trainer by the name of Richie Giacchetti, who worked with Larry Holmes, and was, as part of a contract ploy, was kind of dancing with the idea of turning pro as an alternative to, laboring for what I consider to be less than consistent wages for services rendered. But it didn't work out real well.
Did you have any idea the Raiders were going to draft you?
Oh, God, no. When you play at a small school, right now these folks, if you're at a big school, Oklahoma or Texas, they schedule a pro day, and every team sends a representative there, and they do their drills, whether it's 40-yard dash, vertical jump, all that stuff they do at one time. For someone who's at Villanova, it's interesting because I would say by the end of the season, I really wasn't on a lot of people's radar my senior year. And what I ended up doing was playing high school football with a kid by the name of Joe Restic, who ironically went on to Notre Dame and ended up captaining the team at Notre Dame. And his dad was a very famous Ivy League coach at Harvard, and Joe Restic Sr. And Joe Restic was on the Blue-Gray All-Star Committee. And I think a player got injured or pulled out or something, and they needed someone to, step in for that player, and Joe Resick, I think, was responsible for getting me selected to the Blue-Gray All-Star game. And ironically enough, the coach of that game was Jimmy Johnson, who was then at Oklahoma State. And that was 1980 in December in Alabama. And ended up winning the MVP, and then suddenly I'm on everyone's radar. But when you're a small school guy, I probably ran the kind of pro day drills that you see people doing at bigger schools. I probably did them 25, 30 times. I ran for a scout. This is a true story. Guy knocked on my door on a Sunday at my dorm at St. Mary's, which was the name of the dorm that I lived in, and he wanted me to run on the front lawn of my dorm with sneakers on. And he just checked me off, and that was it. So I ran for everyone. I ran in the rain. I ran in the snow. One time before Villanova had changed their facility, we had to run in the old, if it was snowing or raining, we had to run inside at the old Jake Nevin field house, which was not a big place. It was one of those matchbox kind of Big Five school places. And if you ran a 40-yard dash, you had to start in the hallway of the facility with the double doors open and run catty corner across the gym into the other hallway at the other corner. So I ran at least 2-3 times on really rainy days for scouts at that time. So, and the Raider coach that came by, you know, all these other coaches put me through a battery of tests. The Raider coach came by, eyed me up, talked to me for a couple of minutes, wasn't particularly friendly. There were a couple other scouts there waiting to do something. Had me get in the stands, take 2 steps, come off the ball, take 2 steps, plant, and come inside. And he left, and I wrote them off. And as it turns out, that was the team that ended up drafting me.
You had to be thinking to yourself, this is incredible. I go from a small school Villanova to the Super Bowl champion Raiders.
Well, it was incredible on a lot of levels, yes. You know, I go from Villanova to the Super Bowl champion Oakland Raiders, and it was a team that was larger than life. You know, walking into that locker room as a 21-year-old was pretty shocking. You go from Villanova, where there's a priest on every floor, to the Oakland Raider locker room, and it was amazing. You know, Art Shell, Gene Upshaw, Cliff Branch, Jim Plunkett, Ted Hendricks. Ended up playing with Lyle Alzado there. Lester Hayes. You know, the list goes on. Cedric Hardman, who was my roommate my freshman year, he was Joe Green's roommate in college at North Texas State. He played on that defensive front in San Francisco, was a great pass rusher. I think they called him the Gold Rush. It was Tommy Hart and Cedric. So, yeah, I had no idea what greatness looked like before I walked in that locker room. And then the one thing about the Raiders is, you know, if you want to dare to kind of envision yourself being great, you certainly knew what it looked like because it was all around you, whether it was the owner, it was Jim Otto being around, it was Fred Biletnikoff. Greatness was all around you. Art Shell, Gene Upshaw, those are the guys that brought me up.
What was it like going against those linemen every day in practice?
Oh, early on it was kind of it was like going to graduate school. You know, particularly, you know, Art was just so physically dominant, and Gene was, you know, they took great pride in, for lack of a better term, breaking a young guy in, and those lessons learned in my first year were really greatly appreciated. The further away from it I get, the greater appreciation I have for having guys like that around. I think it's something that's missing in many cases in today's game because of the salary cap, and you can't have that 33, 34-year-old guy around to mentor the younger players. This is how you play, this is how you act, this is how you handle yourself, this is what it means to be great. And I had that all around me, which I was fortunate to have.
Al Davis seemed like he took care of his former players. You mentioned Fred Biletnikoff, Otto, you had Willie Brown. All those guys were coaching. It seems like he embraced the former players. A lot of teams, once you're done, you're done. But every former player I know loved Al Davis.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, that's not going to be the case with everyone, but it's truly one of the iconic franchises in NFL history, and I think Al's impact on the game over how many decades? Whether it's the AFL or coaching the Raiders in the early part of his tenure there, and then hiring, whether it's John Madden, and, how do you hire a guy who, nobody else was considering, and John ends up being, one of the most iconic presence in the history of all of football, both as a coach, as a broadcaster, as what I would like to say would be the conscience of the NFL, making sure that the game is treated and played and thought of the right way, and so many great players from small schools, and Art Shell from Maryland Northern Shores. I'm not even sure of the name of the school, but and also it was kind of the Ellis Island of the NFL. You read the Statue of Liberty, and bring me your tired, I'm not sure the exact quote, but that might as well have been on the front door of the building. Guys that, whether it's Jim Plunkett or the list goes on of players that he brought in, Lyle Alzado, Cedric Hardman, that were great contributors, and players that were yearning to be great as not just individually but collectively and win championships, which ends up defining your career as a player. And I think relationships are built when you win. And those great players that performed well, certainly I think the Raiders have always had a great connection with those players.
What was it like to play that Super Bowl against the Redskins and beat them?
When you're young, Michael Strahan and I have had this conversation. I mean, Michael went to one early and lost badly, but was fortunate enough to, still be a great player at a time, which ended up being his final year and winning one in New York. I won early and thought to myself, I'm looking around, I got Marcus Allen, I got, Jim Plunkett, Cliff Branch, Ted Hendricks, Rod Martin, Lester Hayes, Mike Haynes, the list goes on and on and on. I was thinking, boy, this Super Bowl thing is easy. We'll do this every year. We had lost to Washington, interestingly enough, earlier that year, and it was kind of a shootout. We had a number of players who were out, including Marcus Allen. Cliff Branch pulled a hamstring early in the game. Van McElroy missed the game. We had a number of players that were out in that game, and it was a really hot day up in Washington. And they ended up beating us, and I believe it was a second and long screen pass to Joe Washington. And Joe was just an amazing talent. And ironically enough, fast forward to the Super Bowl, we've got them on the ropes early, and Joe Washington Comes into the game second and backed up second long, and what ends up happening is we substitute Jack Squirick for Matt Millen, and his job is to spy Joe Washington, reads the play perfectly, intercepts the ball, scores a touchdown, game's over. So it was a contrast from the earlier game, particularly defensively. We were dominant. And that, interestingly enough, that I have a great deal of respect for that Redskins team, and particularly their offense, because they were very physical, 2-3 tight ends. They pounded you with a lot of counters, and they were a team that, with I think 3 different quarterbacks, ended up winning 3 Super Bowls and could have won more. And that team that we beat that year had set a scoring record that stood from 1983 until that Randy Moss, Chris Carter team in Washington. Can you believe that?
It's incredible. And again, defenses were tougher back then because there weren't as many restrictions on them.
There still were, but nothing like there is now.
Right.
The bump and run, you could still within 5 yards, you could be very physical. And our corners were, and matter of fact, they were, it was, you could look back at that game as a how-to guide on playing corner. Mike Haynes was so good, he was boring. And, when they talk about the great cover corners of all time, you rarely hear Mike Haynes' name, but, people inside of football, know who Mike Haynes was. And Lester was the consummate, riverboat gambler. A lot of bump and run, and, he really rolled the dice a lot, and more often than not came up a winner. And that performance that those 2 cornerbacks had in the Super Bowl was amazing, really amazing.
Was there a more physical game than that 1984 game against the Bears? It seemed like quarterbacks were going down left and right. Again, the physicality of that game.
It's interesting. I think that Bears defense is, if not the best, one of the best of all time. And one of the reasons is it was the perfect marriage between talent and scheme. No one knew how to block the 46 defense. But then you couple that with the group they had on defense, talent-wise, and it was a prescription for disaster. Particularly when you're on the road. I think we lost 2 quarterbacks and hang on one second, would you?
No problem.
We lost 2 quarterbacks, and the emergency quarterback was either going to be Marcus Allen or Ray Guy. Ray Guy would occasionally run scout teams for us. Ray was a great athlete. He could throw the hell out of the ball. But guys were breaking scot-free. I think, David Humm he blew his ACL, and guys were just beat up. And that was a very physical game. I would say probably for our offense, it was as physical game as they've ever played in, because they brought so much pressure. If you left 5 in, they brought 6 or 7. If you left 6 in, they brought 7 or 8. If you left 7 in, they brought 8. They always brought more than you had, and you were guaranteed at the very least a one-on-one matchup, if not breaking scot-free. And more often than not, somebody got turned totally free. And then, that 46 defense, people figured it out, like the kind of the spread read option where, teams really struggled for a couple of years with the read option, and was it going to be the new wave in the NFL? And then people figured it out, and it went away. And it was the same with the 46 defense. Nobody runs that anymore, really. You can't.
You had a great coach in Tom Flores, won 2 Super Bowls. Why is he not in the Hall of Fame?
That's a good question. Why is he not in the Hall of Fame? Why is Cliff Branch not in the Hall of Fame?
Plunkett.
Jim Plunkett won 2 Super Bowls. Jim's a great story. Jim went to, when you're the number 1 pick, you go to the worst team in football, and Jim nearly got killed up in New England, and ends up signing on with, I think, San Francisco, and, got beat up there, and, Al takes a chance on him, and it ends up, resulting in 2 Super Bowls. Remarkable. There are a number of players that Lester Hayes, another guy, should be up for consideration. There's a lot of really good players from those teams. Cliff Branch threw the fear of God in every defense. And look at Cliff Branch's numbers in playoff games. Look at Cliff Branch's numbers in Super Bowls. And you tell me.
You're right. He was a better player than Lynn Swann, and Lynn gets in again.
They're different. They're different players. I would compare Cliff to the guy down in Dallas. What's his name? Forgive me. The fast wide receiver, track star from
Bob Hayes.
Bobby Hayes, yeah. I would compare him to Bobby Hayes, but Cliff had better hands. Just look at the numbers. Compare the 2 careers. And
No, you're
Cliff
right.
Cliff won 3 Super Bowls. He was on 3 Super Bowl teams.
And then you get a guy like, I love Tony Dungy, but he won 1 Super Bowl. He goes in. And you got Don Coryell's a finalist every year. He never won a Super Bowl. It's just, right. It makes no sense.
Well, here's the irony of it, is that Tom won with 2 Super Bowls with a pretty drastic kind of change in personnel, across the board. That team that won in '83 was completely different than the team that won in 1980, for the most part, particularly on defense. And Marcus Allen, and it was just a different group of players.
How did you feel when you found out you're going in the Hall of Fame?
It's kind of a surreal, feeling. It's a I don't want to say a confirmation of your career. I don't know that you necessarily need that. I think when you've given everything you had to your to the game and your career, and you went till you couldn't go anymore, and you rode off into the sunset. I think you're at peace with that. The process is it's a very tough process, particularly for guys that, have to wait 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, to get in. It's like guys that, you look at the top 10 from last year, and, I don't know the exact names, but each and every one of them is, you could make the case as definitively a Hall of Famer. It's just a question of when. And at some positions, it's more difficult than others. Wide receiver seems to be a position where, there's a real kind of conundrum in terms of, today's numbers versus the numbers, when you're playing for the Steelers and Len Swann and John Stallworth, and they're throwing the ball 22 times a game, you're not going to put up the kind of numbers that teams are putting up now. But, they were big-time players in big-time games. So I think, that's a tough job that people in that room have. And when you get that call, it's really special. And, to have my family there. And, at the time, I think Chris was around 12, 13. and Kyle was 9 or 10, and Howie was 8. And now, fast forward to 2016, Chris is now with the Patriots and going on his 9th year in the league, and Kyle's going into his 4th year with the Bears, and young Howie is in player personnel with the Raiders. So football's definitely in the family.
You might be the first father and son to make the Hall of Fame in a couple of years.
Oh, we're a long way from that, trust me. But yeah, it sure would be nice to have another son, have a son to win a Super Bowl championship. I mean, that's kind of what you play for. And Chris had some decisions to make over the last week after moving on from the Rams, and had a number of places that he could have gone to, but at the end of the day, money wasn't a consideration. It was where do I have the best chance to win now, and that's New England.
What offensive lineman gave you the hardest time?
Not as much an offensive line as much as maybe a system where San Francisco was everything was angle blocking, odd blocks, trap blocks, Bill Joker O's, influence blocks, and the passing game was 3-step drop, 5-step drop, balls out, get the ball to the receiver on a slant or a quick out, and let the receiver run for yards after the catch. So you play in a game, they put 30 points up, and you didn't feel like you felt like you weren't really. It's a totally different feeling when you're playing the Redskins. It's the Hogs. It's 2-3 tight ends. It's John Riggins. You've been in a football game. San Francisco was just more surgical, and it was tackle influence blocks to the outside. The fullback comes from the inside, or tackle influence blocks inside. The fullback comes from the outside and takes your legs out. A lot of high-low blocks and things like that. So San Francisco is probably the biggest challenge, looking back on it. But it was more schematic for me than it was personnel. And anytime you're playing John Elway, people have to realize that when you're playing John Elway, you can't go inside on the tackle. Let's say you're rushing the quarterback. You have to stay outside or just bull rush. So your numbers aren't going to be great, and the way you rush the quarterback's not going to be great because you have to account for John. John was, you talk about teams that were difficult to play against. Any team that had John Elway with his ability to run, extend plays, help his offensive line out was very difficult. John, I played against some great. I talk about an era of great quarterbacks. Jim Kelly, Dan Marino, Warren Moon, John Elway. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And Joe Montana, Steve Young. John, as an entire package, was as difficult as anyone to deal with. Joe was surgical. It was, death by 1,000 cuts. With John, it was, pocket breaks down. John spins out to his left, resets his feet, throws the ball 70 yards across the field on the opposite side of the field, touchdown. That's John. Whereas Joe, 3-step drop, 5-step drop, skinny post, hits whoever in stride, whether it's Jerry or one of their other great receivers, and it's a touchdown.
You went into acting, but I remember you most for those Radio Shack commercials. My wife loved looking at you. She thinks you're absolutely great, but I'm envious of you, not of your football career, but getting to work with my favorite actress, Terry Hatcher. What was that like?
Well, we did about 150 of them. It started out as a kind of a one-year campaign, and it just kept going. And it was prior to Desperate Housewives, and Terry was great to work with, and there was a great chemistry there. And matter of fact, a lot of people thought we were married. It ended up being one of the more successful and influential kind of commercial campaigns that I think changed the style of the way commercials were shot, because it was very bright, and the sets were bright and unique, and they spent a lot of time, creative energy on them.